This is the lecture for week 2 of interoperability for emergency managers, and this will be a little bit shorter lecture because there is also the interview available that I do with Darren Douglas of the City of Mesa. At this point in your emergency management journey, I suspect you have become familiar with the 4 phases of emergency management: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. As emergency managers, your focus on interoperability among internal and external customers and with citizens involves communication throughout these phases in, through, and among all of the involved parties. So let's walk through each of the 4 phases. The goal of mitigation is to reduce the consequences of disaster, or actually reduce the consequence of disasters. At the outset, we know that we cannot prevent crises from taking place, and despite the amount of time and money we commit to the cause, we will not be able to completely prepare for them. So the idea of mitigation is to limit the impact as much as possible. Specifically, the goal is to reduce loss of life, injury, damage to infrastructure, property damage, economic loss, and environmental destruction. Successfully interoperating with citizens means there must be a healthy relationship between you and the community. Creating partnerships with the citizens you serve is integral to putting together an effective community-based hazard mitigation plan. Now that sounds simple enough, but as a general rule, the community is not going to come to you to establish the relationship. Instead, it's incumbent on you to take the initiative to begin and cultivate the relationship. So the way that you develop that relationship is through a threefold plan. First, you identify community risks. So you figure out where the hazards or potential hazards are. Second, you create a plan to fill that gap. In other words, what is your plan to reduce the consequence of those hazards? And then third, get support for the plan. So you might do that through grant writing and other fundraising methods, and gain political support from within the government and, most importantly, with the citizens. And as this plan is put into effect, you will find that you have helped usher in a more secure future while building bonds with the community you serve. The need for interoperability in preparedness is self-evident. Preparedness is a team sport. As far as the people portion of interoperability, it involves, first of all, disseminating information about the situation so there is general public awareness. Second, the coordinating of the various agencies involved in creating an evacuation plan and communicating it to the public. And then third, multidiscipline training and exercises. Interoperability with equipment means being prepared to use a broad range of communications mechanisms and creating and updating communication strategies or plans. In other words, there has to be multiple communications options and a clear method of communicating how to use the equipment. Everything from training on how to use the equipment to pre-established channels for different types of emergencies. Moving on to response, we know that response is what TV shows are made of. If we don't get response right, emergency managers lose their jobs. And frankly, this is where emergency managers earn their keep. We know that in crises, first responders will take care of business, just like they always have. However, if there is not someone proactively initiating, encouraging, facilitating interoperability among all of the responding agencies, the response effort can very quickly become stovepiped. This means that organizations become territorial and information fails to flow appropriately and the entire operation becomes less efficient. And, of course, a failure to respond efficiently can, at a minimum, cost a lot of money and at worst, cost a lot of lives. A good emergency manager will have meaningful relationships already established with all of the people that are involved in response. Believe it or not, one of the most effective ways to create that relationship is to clearly communicate what it is that you can do for them, before the crisis hits, of course. When incident commanders work closely with an emergency manager, it brings a healthy, balanced, holistic approach to solving problems that is not only more efficient, but often results in better decision-making for everyone involved. It's also important to have an emergency communications plan in place that is understood and has been practiced. We'll talk more about that later, but using a communications plan during a response to a crisis will serve the dual purpose of keeping you and your organization out of hot water and will facilitate improved communications. And as far as the equipment for the response, it's important that you actually use it as often as you can. Some pieces, such as radios, will, of course, be used every day. But other aspects of response include the use of specialized audio-video equipment, or command vehicles, or maybe some other interagency radio technologies, like Mesa's communications trailer, and incident management software such as WebEOC. And then closing with the recovery phase, in the recovery phase you typically don't have the same kind of involvement from the police department or fire department incident commanders. Their focus is on response, and they are seldom involved with recovery, which means this is an opportunity for an emergency manager to shine. The initial attack of the crisis has faded, and now you get to see how well you mitigated and prepared. In fact, the recovery phase is the most likely time that an emergency manager could serve as a type of incident commander. There is a lot of communication and direction that takes place in coordinating government agencies, the private sector, and volunteer and community organizations, as well as many other non-governmental organizations. A well-prepared emergency manager probably will not get his or her credit until the recovery effort is underway, or maybe even perhaps not until it's in the rearview mirror. But that's okay. Being an emergency manager isn't sexy, but it's a crucial part of making a community whole again.